Sir Francis Walsingham personally mortgaged his family estates and exhausted his private credit to get cash to pay a spy network spread across Europe and hire workers to melt wax seals to secretly read letters to finalize death sentences for the nobility. This network continuously bribed port officials across Europe to track the precise logistical movements and stockpile inventories of the Spanish Armada before the opponent's warships could set sail. Paying out of pocket for this spy system caused him to bear debts on behalf of the court, but was resolutely refused reimbursement by the Queen. His corpse had to be carried away for a hurried burial in the night to hide from creditors coming to seize his assets. The most powerful security official in England died bankrupt without a single penny left to buy a stone slab for his tomb. In the mid-16th century, England faced severe political and religious turmoil under consecutive Tudor monarchs. Sir Francis Walsingham was born into this unstable environment around 1532. His wealthy family had recently transitioned from London merchants to the landed gentry in Kent. He quickly learned that political power was fragile and could collapse without warning. His relatives were deeply entrenched in the administrative and legal machinery of the English crown. His father, a successful lawyer, helped inventory Cardinal Wolsey's seized property after the cardinal lost royal favor. Additionally, his uncle served as lieutenant of the Tower of London. These roles demonstrated the harsh, practical consequences of falling out of political favor. Maternal connections further embedded him in the complex web of Tudor court politics. His mother was the sister of Sir Anthony Denny, a prominent attendant to King Henry VIII. After his father's early death, his mother remarried, linking their family directly to the Boleyn circle. These alliances provided significant influence but carried constant, life-threatening risks. His sisters also married into prominent Protestant political families. These marriages mattered because politics in Tudor England was carried through households and kinship as much as through formal offices. A person's relatives could provide introductions, protection, information, or danger. By the time Francis reached adulthood, he did not stand alone. He belonged to a network of educated Protestants with connections to Parliament, finance, and royal administration. As the only surviving male heir, he received a strong private education. He studied English, arithmetic, rhetoric, and languages, becoming fluent in French, Italian, Latin, and Greek. In 1548, he entered King's College, Cambridge. This was during the reign of Edward VI, when Protestant reform had moved much further than it had under Henry VIII. Cambridge had become one of the centers of that change. Walsingham encountered the ideas of men such as John Chake and Martin Bucer, and his Protestant beliefs developed in an atmosphere where religion was not treated as a private preference. It was a program for restructuring the church and, by extension, the political order. He left Cambridge without a degree around 1551, which was not unusual for a gentleman intending to enter public life rather than the clergy. After some travel in Europe, he returned to London and entered Gray's Inn in 1552 to study civil law. That legal training later became important. Intelligence work in the Tudor period was not only about secrets, it was also about evidence, confiscation, correspondence, property, treason statutes, and the ability to turn information into a case that the government could use. Then the political direction of the country changed almost overnight. Edward VI died in July 1553 at the age of 15. Protestant nobles tried unsuccessfully to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne, but Mary Tudor defeated the attempt and became queen. Mary I's religious program was the opposite of the one Walsingham had known at Cambridge. She restored Catholic worship, moved to restore papal authority, revived the heresy laws, and began prosecuting Protestants. Hundreds were eventually burned, including prominent reformers such as Thomas Cranmer, Hugh Latimer, and Nicholas Ridley. For a committed Protestant in his early 20s, the risk was obvious. Walsingham left England and joined the community later known as the Marian Exiles. He entered a transnational world of refugees, reformers, students, and political activists. The experience changed the scale on which he understood politics. England's religious conflict was one part of a wider European struggle. Walsingham was closely connected to the environment surrounding Wyatt's rebellion in 1554. His family estates lay in Kent, one of the rebellion's main recruiting areas. The episode exposed him to the mechanics of conspiracy, local networks, rapid mobilization, and the speed of royal retaliation. By 1555, he was studying civil law at the University of Padua. This period was especially important because Padua stood within the Republic of Venice. Venice had developed a highly organized political culture in which diplomacy and information gathering were closely linked. Its government expected ambassadors to report systematically on foreign courts, alliances, military preparations, personalities, and rumors. Sensitive reports could be written in cipher. Information was collected not as gossip, but as an instrument of state policy. Walsingham observed this environment while continuing his legal studies. He was elected as a representative of the English student body, an early sign of his administrative ability. More importantly, he saw a model of government that relied on structured information. A state did not have to wait until an enemy army crossed its border. It could study intentions before action began, compare reports from different sources, conceal its own communications, and make political decisions from a wider field of knowledge. During his years abroad, Walsingham also moved through Protestant centers such as Basel, Geneva, and Frankfurt. He formed relationships with exiles, including John Foxe and the Scottish reformer John Knox. The Marian exile community later gave him access to couriers, correspondents, scholars, and men willing to operate across borders. Exile left a lasting mark on his political outlook. He had watched a change of monarch turn religious belief into a matter of criminal law, and he saw how decisions made across Europe could quickly affect England. Security increasingly meant knowing what was being discussed abroad before it became action at home. Mary I died in November 1558, and Elizabeth I succeeded her. Walsingham returned to England. The country he came back to was not politically settled simply because the crown had changed hands again. Elizabeth restored Protestant rule, but she inherited deep religious division and serious external threats. England was weaker than the major Catholic powers of Europe and could not assume that domestic Catholic opposition would remain separate from foreign intervention. Walsingham entered Parliament in 1559 with the support of Francis Russell, 2nd Earl of Bedford, another Protestant with connections to the exile community. He represented Bossigny and later Lyme Regis. At this stage, however, his career still resembled that of a well-connected Protestant gentleman. His private life also strengthened his political and financial connections. In 1562, he married Anne Barne, the daughter of a former Lord Mayor of London. The marriage connected him to London's commercial and maritime world. Anne died in 1564. 2 years later, Walsingham married Ursula St. Barbe. Through this marriage, he gained responsibility for substantial property on the Isle of Wight, while Ursula became a stable partner through the increasingly demanding years of his public career. The next major change came not from inside England, but from Rome. In February 1570, Pope Pius V issued the bull Regnans in Excelsis, excommunicating Elizabeth I and releasing her Catholic subjects from allegiance to her. For Elizabeth's government, the political implications were severe. Religious loyalty could now be interpreted as a possible link to rebellion, assassination, or foreign invasion. That fear appeared to be confirmed by the Ridolfi plot of 1571. Roberto Ridolfi, an Italian banker, became involved in a conspiracy that sought foreign support for the removal of Elizabeth, the elevation of Mary, Queen of Scots, and a Catholic political settlement supported by Spain. The Duke of Norfolk, one of the highest-ranking nobles in England, was implicated. Working under William Cecil, Lord Burghley, Walsingham helped dismantle the network. The investigation reinforced a central lesson. Serious threats were networks linking money, correspondence, noble patrons, foreign courts, and domestic agents. By then, Walsingham had already been sent to France as Elizabeth's ambassador. He arrived in 1570 with several difficult assignments. England wanted a defensive relationship with France against the power of Spain, and Walsingham was also involved in negotiations surrounding the possibility of Elizabeth marrying the Duke of Alençon. He disliked the marriage proposal and warned against the political consequences of binding the English queen to a foreign Catholic prince. In France, Walsingham learned how far public declarations could differ from private intentions. He watched court factions, religious tensions, and foreign alignments at close range. Then, in August 1572, the violence around him moved beyond negotiation. Paris had filled with Protestant Huguenot nobles who had come for the marriage of Marguerite of Valois and Henry of Navarre. The marriage was supposed to help reduce religious tension. Instead, after the attack on the Protestant leader Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the city descended into mass killing. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre spread through Paris and then beyond it. Thousands of Protestants were killed. Walsingham was in the city with his pregnant wife, Ursula, and their young daughter, Frances. His embassy on the Faubourg Saint-Germain became a place of refuge for English residents and French Protestants trying to escape the violence. Among those sheltered there was the young Philip Sidney, who would later become Walsingham's son-in-law. For Walsingham, the massacre was not an abstract lesson in European religious conflict. He experienced it from inside a diplomatic residence while trying to protect his family and others under his roof. The event hardened a conclusion already forming during his exile. Treaties and official assurances could not by themselves guarantee security. A government that depended only on what foreign rulers said in public was operating with incomplete information. He did not abandon diplomacy, but increasingly treated it as only one layer of statecraft. Beneath formal negotiations lay private correspondence, money, religious networks, military planning, and personal ambition. Someone had to collect those hidden pieces before a crisis became visible. In December 1573, Walsingham returned to the center of government as principal secretary and a member of the Privy Council. On paper, the office involved royal correspondence and administration. In practice, it gave him access to the flow of information moving between the crown, diplomats, local officials, merchants, and foreign contacts. He now had the position from which he could put the lessons of his first 40 years into practice. His family had taught him how close administration could stand to punishment. Cambridge had given him an ideological commitment to Protestant reform. Mary I's reign had made him an exile. Padua had shown him a state that treated intelligence as a system rather than a collection of rumors. The Protestant communities of Europe had given him contacts across borders. The Ridolfi plot had demonstrated how conspiracy could connect English nobles with foreign powers. Paris had shown him what could happen when political assurances failed and violence moved faster than diplomacy. The next stage of his career would be different from everything that came before it. Walsingham was no longer simply observing the machinery of power from the outside. He was about to build his own. When Francis Walsingham became principal secretary in December 1573, he gained access to one of the most important positions in Elizabeth I government. Officially, the job centered on royal correspondence, diplomacy, and administration, but Walsingham gradually used the office for something much broader. Instead of treating intelligence as an occasional tool for moments of crisis, he began organizing it as a permanent part of national security. England already had spies, informers, intercepted letters, and diplomatic contacts long before Walsingham entered office. What was missing was a system capable of bringing all these sources together, comparing them, and preserving the information long enough for patterns to emerge. Walsingham's real innovation was therefore not the invention of espionage, but the transformation of scattered intelligence into a coordinated process. Much of that work centered on his private residence at Seething Lane in London. The house functioned not only as a family home but also as an administrative center where clerks handled correspondence arriving from England and continental Europe. Reports from diplomats, merchants, travelers, informers, and agents could be copied, organized, compared with earlier material, and then incorporated into a growing body of political intelligence. Walsingham wanted more than isolated reports about immediate events. His clerks accumulated information about foreign ministers, military officers, Catholic exiles, diplomats, and other figures who might affect English security. Their political alliances, financial difficulties, habits, personal relationships, religious loyalties, and known contacts could all become useful, because one small detail might acquire significance when it appeared again in another report months later. This method addressed one of the basic problems of intelligence work. Individual sources were often unreliable. An informant could exaggerate, misunderstand what he had heard, or deliberately provide false information, while foreign governments could circulate rumors intended to mislead their enemies. Walsingham, therefore, placed considerable value on comparing reports from different locations rather than trusting a single dramatic piece of information. A report arriving from Paris, for example, might become more credible if information from Antwerp or an English merchant in another port pointed in the same direction. A name found in one intercepted letter could be checked against older correspondence or against the testimony of another agent. In this way, Seething Lane increasingly functioned as a place where information was analyzed rather than simply received. The people Walsingham recruited reflected this need for detailed analysis. He preferred educated agents who could understand languages, politics, and the social environments in which they operated, and universities such as Oxford and Cambridge provided a useful pool of potential recruits. A young scholar fluent in Latin, French, or Italian could move through European universities and aristocratic households much more naturally than an obvious professional spy. Some agents, therefore, traveled under the cover of scholarship, diplomacy, or private employment, while others worked as secretaries attached to ambassadors and political households. Their task was not merely to steal documents whenever possible, but to observe the relationships surrounding political decisions. Walsingham wanted to know who influenced a ruler, which ministers disagreed with one another, what military preparations were serious, and whether official declarations reflected genuine policy. Commercial networks gave him another source of information that formal diplomacy could not easily provide. English merchants and sailors moved constantly between ports in France, Spain, the Low Countries, Italy, and elsewhere, placing them in locations where military preparations could be observed without attracting unusual attention. A trader might notice the accumulation of timber, grain, gunpowder, rope, artillery, or shipping before an ambassador received any formal explanation. Merchant routes were equally useful for moving Walsingham's own correspondence. Reports could be concealed within ordinary cargo, passed through trusted commercial contacts, or carried by sailors accustomed to crossing political boundaries. Rather than creating an entirely separate communication system, Walsingham often made use of trade routes that already connected England with European cities and ports. A more dangerous part of his network operated inside Catholic communities. After Elizabeth's excommunication in 1570, the government became increasingly concerned about English Catholic exiles and the seminaries abroad that trained priests for missions back into England. Not every missionary priest was involved in conspiracy, but Walsingham feared that the same routes used for religious activity could also carry political messages, money, or contacts connected to foreign intervention. He therefore wanted detailed information about the men being trained in institutions such as those at Rome and Douai, the people financing them, the routes they intended to use when returning to England, and the households likely to shelter them. Agents who could enter these communities were especially valuable because they could provide information long before a priest or political courier reached an English port. Such operations required men whose loyalties were often deliberately difficult to read. Some were disillusioned priests, some posed as committed Catholics, and others worked primarily for money rather than ideology. Walsingham understood that espionage did not offer the certainty of ordinary administration, so he judged agents less by their personal character than by whether their information could be verified against other sources. Gathering correspondence presented another challenge because political letters were normally protected by wax seals bearing recognizable impressions. Breaking a seal openly would reveal immediately that the document had been intercepted, which might provide one piece of information but destroy the communication channel that produced it. Walsingham, therefore, needed methods that allowed his office to read letters while keeping the sender and recipient unaware. For this purpose, he employed Arthur Gregory, a specialist capable of manipulating sealed documents with remarkable precision. By carefully applying heat beneath the wax, Gregory could sometimes loosen the seal without damaging the visible impression above it, allowing the letter to be opened and copied. Once the contents had been examined, the seal could be returned and the correspondence allowed to continue toward its intended destination. When a seal could not be removed safely, Gregory could reproduce it by taking an impression and creating a counterfeit matrix. The objective was not simply technical cleverness, it was to preserve the illusion that the communication remained private. If the recipient noticed nothing unusual, he would probably continue using the same channel, producing more information for Walsingham's office. This principle became one of the defining features of Walsingham's counterintelligence method. Rather than automatically shutting down a compromised network, he often preferred to keep it functioning under surveillance. A letter intercepted once might expose a single conspirator, while months of undetected correspondence could reveal financiers, couriers, safe houses, foreign sponsors, and the broader chain of command. Opening the letter, however, did not guarantee that Walsingham could read it. Governments and political conspirators commonly used nomenclators, systems that replaced ordinary letters or words with numbers and symbols, while also inserting meaningless characters known as nulls. Names, places, and politically sensitive terms might receive individual codes, making a well-designed message extremely difficult to understand without the key. Walsingham therefore employed Thomas Philippus, whose combination of linguistic and mathematical ability made him one of the most valuable members of the operation. Philippus used techniques related to frequency analysis, studying how often particular symbols appeared and comparing those patterns with the normal structure of the language in which the original message had probably been written. Because letters and combinations do not occur with equal frequency in any language, apparently random symbols could eventually reveal patterns. Once Philippus identified several likely substitutions, recurring words and names helped him reconstruct additional parts of the cipher, while meaningless nulls could gradually be separated from genuine content. A document that initially looked unreadable could therefore be reconstructed piece by piece. The combination of intercepted correspondence, undamaged seals, cipher analysis, and organized archives gave Walsingham a capability that went well beyond conventional investigation. Yet the most important part of his method was often patience. Once he discovered a suspect, he did not necessarily order an immediate arrest, because removing one person too early could warn everyone else in the network. Walsingham instead tried to understand the complete structure behind an individual suspect. He wanted to identify who supplied money, who carried messages, which houses provided shelter, which foreign officials were involved, and where instructions ultimately originated. Only when enough evidence had accumulated would the government move against the network as a whole. No case demonstrated this approach more clearly than the conspiracy surrounding Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary had been held in England since 1568, but imprisonment had not removed her political significance. As a Catholic former queen with a claim to the English succession, she remained a natural focal point for those who wanted Elizabeth removed and Catholic rule restored. For Walsingham, this created a persistent security problem because almost every major Catholic conspiracy could potentially gather around Mary, even when she had not initiated it herself. Foreign supporters could treat her as an alternative sovereign, while English conspirators could imagine replacing Elizabeth with a queen whose legitimacy they considered stronger. As long as Mary remained alive, simply guarding her did not eliminate the political possibilities attached to her name. Elizabeth nevertheless resisted the idea of executing another anointed monarch. Doing so would create a precedent that she herself had reason to fear, particularly in an age when rebels could claim religious justification for resisting rulers. Walsingham was much less willing to accept the continuing risk and increasingly sought evidence that would connect Mary personally to a plot against Elizabeth's life. The opportunity came in 1586, when Mary was held at Chartley under the supervision of Sir Amyas Paulet. Her movements were restricted, and her communication with the outside world was tightly controlled. On the surface, isolating her appeared to be the safest approach, but Walsingham recognized that complete isolation could also create an opportunity because Mary and her supporters would become increasingly eager to find any route around the restrictions. Instead of waiting for a secure channel to appear beyond his control, Walsingham allowed one to develop inside a system already penetrated by his agents. Gilbert Gifford became central to this arrangement. Coming from an English Catholic background and possessing convincing connections to Catholic networks abroad, Gifford could present himself to Mary's supporters as a reliable intermediary while secretly cooperating with Walsingham. Through Gifford, a method was established for carrying encrypted correspondence into and out of Chartley by means of a local brewer. Letters were rolled tightly, placed inside small containers, and hidden in the bungs of beer barrels delivered to the household. To Mary and her supporters, the system appeared both simple and secure because routine beer deliveries attracted far less attention than suspicious visitors or private couriers. In reality, the entire communication route was compromised. The brewer cooperated with Walsingham's operation. Paulet permitted the deliveries to continue, and Gifford ensured that the messages passed through government hands. Every important letter could therefore be removed, opened, copied, decoded by Philippes, returned to its container, and then delivered without revealing that anyone had intercepted it. This was precisely the kind of operation Walsingham preferred, because the target believed she had escaped surveillance, when in fact surveillance had become almost complete. Mary could now communicate more freely than before, but every additional message provided Walsingham with more information. The apparent success of the secret channel encouraged the conspirators to expose themselves rather than forcing them further underground. Anthony Babington eventually entered this correspondence. A young Catholic gentleman from Derbyshire, Babington had connections with Catholic exiles and supporters of Mary, and he became involved with a group considering an ambitious plan against Elizabeth's government. The proposed conspiracy combined domestic rebellion, foreign intervention, Mary's liberation, and the assassination of Elizabeth herself. On the 6th July 1586, Babington sent Mary a ciphered letter describing the plan in considerable detail. Among the most important elements was the proposal that 6 men would be responsible for killing Elizabeth, while other supporters would help release Mary and support the wider uprising. The message traveled through the supposedly secure beer barrel system and therefore passed directly into Walsingham's hands. Felipes decoded the document, giving the government evidence that an assassination conspiracy existed, but Walsingham still refused to close the operation. Babington's intentions alone were not his ultimate objective. He wanted Mary's response because a reply indicating her approval could transform the case from another conspiracy organized in her name into evidence against Mary herself. Mary received Babington's message and answered on the 17th July 1586. Her reply again traveled through the same channel, was intercepted, and reached Felipes for decryption. The decoded letter contained the confirmation Walsingham had been waiting for. Mary responded in terms that could be interpreted as authorizing the proposed operation against Elizabeth. Felipes immediately recognized the importance of what he had decoded and drew a small gallows on the document. For Walsingham, however, even this was not necessarily the end of the investigation, because Babington had referred to 6 men who would carry out the assassination without clearly identifying all of them. Destroying the conspiracy before discovering those names would leave part of the network unknown. At this point, the operation moved beyond passive interception into active manipulation. Acting on Walsingham's instructions, Felipes added a forged postscript to Mary's correspondence, reproducing the cipher and asking Babington to provide the identities of the 6 men chosen to kill Elizabeth. The addition was designed to appear as though Mary herself wanted the information. The significance of the operation was now much larger than the interception of a single treasonous letter. Walsingham had created a communication route that Mary believed belonged to her supporters, allowed the conspiracy to develop inside that controlled environment, read the messages without exposing the surveillance, and then used the compromised channel to gather further evidence. By July 1586, he possessed what he had spent years trying to obtain: written material capable of linking Mary directly to a conspiracy against Elizabeth's life. He also had access to the network around Babington and the possibility of identifying the men intended to carry out the assassination. Only after allowing the conspirators to expose themselves this far was Walsingham ready to close the trap. The Babington correspondence gave Walsingham what he had been trying to obtain for years: evidence that could connect Mary, Queen of Scots, directly to a conspiracy against Elizabeth I. But possessing the letters was not the same as ending the operation. Walsingham had deliberately allowed the network to continue long enough to expose its structure. Once he was satisfied that the principal participants had revealed themselves, the government moved. Anthony Babington and the men around him were arrested during the summer of 1586. Their plans were no longer based on suspicion or second-hand accusations, as Walsingham's office now possessed intercepted correspondence that described rebellion, foreign intervention, Mary's liberation, and Elizabeth's assassination. The conspirators were prosecuted for treason. In September 1586, Babington and several of his associates were executed by hanging, drawing, and quartering, the standard punishment for men convicted of high treason. The first executions were so severe that public reaction disturbed Elizabeth, prompting her to order that the remaining prisoners be killed more quickly. The larger political question, however, was Mary. Elizabeth had spent almost 2 decades keeping her cousin alive while preventing her from exercising political power, but that compromise was becoming impossible to maintain. Mary was transferred from Chartley to Fotheringhay Castle, and a special commission of 36 men was assembled to hear the case against her. Mary's position was difficult from the beginning. She argued that she was a sovereign queen and therefore could not legally be treated as an English subject accused of treason. She had never accepted Elizabeth's authority over her in the same way that an English noble would. Furthermore, she had no ordinary legal counsel and limited access to the material being used against her. The government's central evidence came from the intercepted correspondence, and Mary understood immediately where the case was leading. She attacked the reliability of the documents, During her trial, Mary directly accused Walsingham of forging the letters and engineering the entire conspiracy to destroy her. This accusation went to the center of Walsingham's methods. His operation had indeed manipulated communications. Philippus had added a forged postscript to one of Mary's letters to identify additional conspirators, and the communication channel itself had been controlled by Walsingham's agents. However, the government's case depended on distinguishing that manipulation from the original message Mary had sent. When Mary accused Walsingham personally, he responded in unusually careful terms. He declared that as a private individual, he had done nothing unworthy of an honest man, and that as principal secretary, he had done nothing inconsistent with the duties of his office. The wording mattered. Walsingham did not claim that he had never deceived Mary, as deception was part of his office. His defense was simply that he had acted as a servant of the state against someone he considered a threat to the Queen. Ultimately, Mary was found guilty. For Walsingham, the intelligence problem had effectively been solved, but the political problem remained. Elizabeth did not approach Mary's execution with the certainty that some of her ministers displayed. Killing a queen was fundamentally different from executing an ordinary conspirator, as Elizabeth's own authority rested partly on the principle that monarchs possessed a special political status. If one sovereign could be judged and executed by another government, the precedent could eventually be used against Elizabeth herself. There were also diplomatic consequences. Mary had powerful Catholic supporters abroad, and her death could be used as further justification for war against England. For months, Elizabeth hesitated. Walsingham and other members of the Privy Council viewed the situation differently. Every year Mary remained alive created the possibility of another conspiracy. From their perspective, the Babington plot had demonstrated that imprisonment alone had not removed the threat. The conflict between Elizabeth and her ministers was therefore not simply a disagreement about Mary, but a reflection of two different understandings of political risk. Elizabeth wanted security without accepting all the consequences of permanently removing her rival, while Walsingham wanted the source of repeated conspiracies eliminated once and for all. Walsingham actively participated in efforts to increase public fear of invasion and Catholic conspiracy. Reports circulated in London suggesting that Spanish forces might already have landed or that immediate danger was approaching, which helped create pressure for decisive action against Mary. Eventually, Elizabeth signed the death warrant, though even then she remained reluctant to assume direct responsibility for what followed. The Privy Council moved forward. The Great Seal was attached to the warrant, and the order was sent to Fotheringhay. Walsingham, meanwhile, was absent from the final administrative process on the grounds of illness. Whether this absence was simply genuine sickness or useful political distance, the effect was the same. Responsibility for carrying out the execution was spread across the council rather than concentrated entirely on him. On the 8th February 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed at Fotheringhay Castle. The execution itself went badly. The first blow of the axe did not remove her head, and a second blow still did not completely finish the task, requiring a third. When the executioner lifted the severed head, the auburn hair by which he held it proved to be a wig. It detached, revealing Mary's short gray hair beneath. Her small dog was later discovered beneath her clothing, close to the blood surrounding the scaffold. Mary's death ended one of the longest-running security problems of Elizabeth's reign, but it did not end the larger conflict that had produced it. For Spain, England remained a Protestant state interfering with Spanish interests in Europe and the Atlantic. English privateers attacked Spanish shipping, and Elizabeth supported Protestant resistance in the Netherlands. The execution of Mary simply added another grievance to an already serious confrontation. By this point, Walsingham's intelligence network extended far beyond conspirators inside England. as he was actively collecting information about Spain's military preparations across Europe. The Spanish monarchy under Philip II possessed resources England could not match directly. Spain controlled a large imperial system, commanded experienced armies, and could draw wealth from territories across Europe and the Americas. If England waited until major invasion force appeared in the Channel, it would have very little time to respond. Walsingham therefore treated Spanish preparations as an intelligence problem long before the Armada sailed. One of the important agents within this wider system was Anthony Standen. Operating in Italy, Standen developed connections that gave him access to information coming from Spanish political circles. Through his relationship with the Tuscan ambassador in Madrid, he was able to obtain reports about Spanish military planning and transmit them toward England. Walsingham's network successfully acquired extraordinarily detailed intelligence concerning the Armada, the exact number and type of vessels, artillery placements, supply requirements, and other logistical preparations. This information allowed English leaders to estimate not simply whether Spain intended to attack, but precisely how such an operation would have to function. An invasion fleet required much more than warships. It required credit, food, water, barrels, timber, powder, ammunition, rope replacement equipment, and reliable coordination with forces elsewhere in Europe. Every requirement created another point where an intelligence service could observe or interfere with the operation. Walsingham understood finance particularly well. He recognized that while Philip II's military power was enormous, it was also exceptionally expensive. The Spanish monarchy relied on European credit markets and banking networks to convert long-term imperial resources into the cash necessary to pay soldiers, purchase supplies, and prepare fleets. Italian banking centers therefore mattered almost as much as naval ports. Walsingham actively weaponized finance, instructing his English commercial contacts to spread deliberate rumors of Spanish financial weakness and impending bankruptcy to freeze Philip II's credit lines. The purpose was to damage confidence among lenders and make it more difficult for Philip to obtain immediate credit. In an age before modern central banking, confidence could have direct military consequences. A ruler might possess territories, taxation rights, and future income, but still be unable to launch an operation on schedule if lenders refuse to provide short-term financing. Because of this, Spanish preparations suffered delays, and England used the additional time to its advantage. In 1587, Sir Francis Drake sailed against the Spanish port of Cadiz in a major preemptive attack. The raid is often remembered for the destruction and capture of Spanish ships, but its impact on logistics was equally important. Among the materials destroyed were large quantities of wooden staves required for producing barrels, which were essential military equipment. A fleet at sea needed them for fresh water, wine, salted meat, and other supplies, and the quality of the wood mattered immensely. Proper barrel staves had to be seasoned so that they remained stable during long voyages. Destroy enough of that supply, and replacement barrels had to be produced quickly from inferior material. This disruption forced the Spanish to use green, insufficiently seasoned wood for some of their barrels when the Armada eventually sailed. The consequences were practical rather than spectacular. Green timber could warp and shrink, causing barrels to leak. Water could become contaminated, food could spoil, and wine could deteriorate, leaving men already living in crowded ships far more vulnerable to disease. This was exactly the kind of weakness Walsingham understood perfectly. An invading fleet did not have to be destroyed entirely in battle to become ineffective. If its financing was delayed, supplies damaged, communications compromised, and personnel weakened by disease, its fighting capacity could sharply decline before its largest engagement. By the summer of 1588, the Spanish Armada was finally ready to sail. The basic Spanish plan required the fleet to move through the English Channel and link with the Duke of Parma's army in the Low Countries. which would then be transported across the Channel for the invasion of England. The coordination required between the fleet and Parma was difficult, and the English government already knew a great deal about the force approaching it. While Walsingham's intelligence did not replace the Navy, England still depended on commanders, sailors, cannon, weather, and a series of operational decisions. Once the Armada entered the Channel, intelligence had fundamentally changed the conditions under which those forces operated. England had received ample warning, Spanish preparations had been observed for years, and information about the fleet had crossed Europe long before the fleet itself crossed the sea. English commanders were not facing an entirely unknown enemy. The Armada entered the Channel in late July 1588. English ships under commanders including Lord Howard of Effingham and Francis Drake engaged the Spanish formation while carefully avoiding the kind of close-range fighting in which Spain hoped to use its soldiers. The decisive crisis developed near Calais. While the Spanish fleet anchored waiting for coordination with Parma's forces, the English sent fire ships toward the anchorage, forcing Spanish captains to cut their cables and scatter. The following Battle of Gravelines disrupted the Armada further. Though the Spanish fleet was not annihilated there, its invasion plan had become impossible. Unable to join successfully with Parma, the Armada moved northward around Scotland and Ireland in an attempt to return to Spain. Bad weather, navigational problems, damaged vessels, illness, and shortages then imposed devastating additional losses. Ships were wrecked along the coasts, men died from disease, injury, exposure, and lack of supplies, and the invasion ultimately failed. For Elizabeth's government, the result was an enormous strategic victory. For Walsingham, it also represented the strongest demonstration of the intelligence method he had spent years building. The Armada had been confronted at sea, but the contest had begun much earlier. It had begun in intercepted reports from foreign courts, with agents operating in commercial and diplomatic circles, in the study of Spanish finances, and in the distant ports where ships and supplies were being assembled. Walsingham's idea of national defense did not begin at England's coastline. It began wherever reliable information about a threat could be obtained. By the end of 1588, two of the greatest dangers that had occupied his career had been removed. Mary, Queen of Scots, was dead, and the Spanish Armada had failed. Elizabeth remained on the throne, and England remained independent and Protestant. From the outside, Walsingham had reached the most successful point of his public career. Inside his own household, however, his position was almost the exact reverse. The financial pressure had become crushing. His daughter Frances had married Philip Sidney, the young Protestant aristocrat, whom Walsingham had once helped shelter during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Sidney became one of the most celebrated figures of Elizabethan England, known both as a writer and as a soldier. In 1586, while fighting in the Netherlands, he was wounded at the Battle of Zutphen and died several weeks later. His death left more than grief behind. Sidney had accumulated enormous debts, partly through the costs of military service amounting to a staggering £6,000. Walsingham chose to assume those debts in order to protect his daughter and preserve Sidney's estate and reputation. Already financing intelligence work for the crown, he was now also carrying the crippling financial burden left by his son-in-law. Elizabethan England lacked a centrally funded intelligence service. National security was effectively outsourced to the personal credit of loyal ministers. Walsingham operated within a ruthless political economy where the Queen demanded absolute security, but systematically refused to underwrite its cost. Every intercepted letter from Madrid, every bribed dockworker in Cadiz, and every cryptographer laboring at Seething Lane was financed directly from Walsingham's own pocket. To sustain this massive apparatus, he functioned like a desperate venture capitalist, mortgaging his lands and borrowing from London syndicates at crushing commercial interest rates of 10 to 14%. Elizabeth's deliberate policy of underfunding her ministers ensured their utter dependence on the crown. In Walsingham's case, it transformed statecraft into a private debt trap. By the end, the machinery of surveillance he engineered had successfully neutralized the Spanish Empire and decapitated the Scottish Queen. Yet that exact same machinery cannibalized the private fortune of the man who built it. At the same time, his health was declining. Years of political pressure, travel, administrative work, and financial anxiety had taken a visible toll. He suffered from chronic kidney stones and severe urinary problems. In the 16th century, such conditions could produce prolonged pain with very limited possibilities for effective treatment. There were no antibiotics for serious urinary infections and no modern surgical procedures capable of treating many of the underlying problems safely. Even a condition that might now be managed medically could become disabling or fatal. Walsingham continued working despite recurring illness, but by the late 1580s his physical condition had clearly deteriorated. He also suffered from aggressive testicular cancer near the end of his life. By 1590, Walsingham was no longer dealing only with the accumulated exhaustion of public service. His body was failing at the same time that his finances remained unresolved, and the government continued to depend on his office. On the 6th of April 1590, Francis Walsingham died at his house on Seething Lane in London. He was around 58 years old. The location was significant because Seething Lane had served as the administrative center of much of his intelligence activity. For years, reports, letters, agents, codes, and foreign information had flowed through that house. Almost immediately after his death, however, a different kind of pressure surrounded the property. Creditors moved against the estate. There was a very real danger that an insolvent debtor's body could be seized under an arrest of the corpse, using burial as leverage against the surviving family until outstanding debts were addressed. Whether understood as a formal legal mechanism or as the practical coercive power available to creditors, the threat was serious enough that Ursula Walsingham acted quickly. A normal funeral for a principal secretary would have required preparation, public notice, and time. Time was exactly what the family did not have if they wanted to avoid interference. As a result, there was no large state funeral and no elaborate public procession through London. Walsingham's burial was organized almost immediately. On the night of the 7th April 1590, roughly 24 hours after his death, his coffin was taken quietly from Seething Lane under cover of darkness. The burial took place at around 10 o'clock at night. Only a small number of relatives and trusted servants accompanied the coffin. It was carried to Old St. Paul's Cathedral, where Walsingham was buried in the choir. There was no major monument marking the grave, and no public ceremony equal to the scale of his service. The contrast was severe. Walsingham had spent more than 16 years as one of the most important officials in Elizabeth's government. He had helped dismantle conspiracies, built extensive foreign intelligence networks, penetrated Catholic communications, and contributed to preparations against the Spanish Armada. Yet his burial was hurried, quiet, and largely private. The Crown did not create a grand memorial around him. His death did not produce the kind of public celebration that later generations might expect for a minister associated with national survival. In practical terms, the immediate problem was not commemoration but debt. His family had to deal with creditors before it could think about reputation. The financial disputes surrounding Walsingham also did not end with his burial. His accounts were complicated because money moved in both directions. On paper, Walsingham owed substantial sums to the state. At the same time, the state owed him large amounts for money he had advanced in royal service. The eventual figures showed approximately £43,000 owed by Walsingham against roughly £48,000 owed to him by the government. The difference is important because it shows how misleading the image of Walsingham as simply a ruined debtor could be. His financial collapse was tied closely to unresolved state expenditure. The accounts were not finally settled during Elizabeth's reign. It was only in 1611, more than 20 years after Walsingham's death and during the reign of James I, that the courts effectively ruled that the competing obligations should cancel one another. By then, any practical benefit to Walsingham himself was obviously impossible. The decision came far too late to change what his family had already experienced. Ursula had already faced the creditors. The hurried burial had already happened. Property had already been burdened by years of borrowing. A later legal judgment could clarify the accounts, but it could not undo the consequences of leaving them unresolved while Walsingham was alive. Even his burial place did not survive permanently. Old St. Paul's Cathedral was destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666. The building containing Walsingham's grave disappeared, and with it any physical certainty about the precise location of his remains. He ended without a major surviving tomb around which later generations could build a public memory. This partly explains why Walsingham's reputation developed differently from that of other famous Elizabethans. Francis Drake could be remembered through naval victory and circumnavigation. Walter Raleigh became associated with exploration and colonial ambition. Philip Sidney became an idealized soldier and writer. William Cecil remained closely linked with the visible administration of Elizabeth's government. Walsingham's greatest successes were much harder to represent. Intelligence work is most effective when the target does not know it has happened. A battle produces a visible field, commanders, ships, casualties, and territory. An intelligence success may consist of a letter opened without detection, a name quietly added to a file, or a payment to an agent whose identity must remain secret. His reputation was therefore shaped as much by methods as by results. To many Catholic opponents, Walsingham was a persecutor who penetrated religious networks, intercepted private correspondence, recruited double agents, and helped send conspirators to execution. The Babington operation in particular gave later critics strong reasons to question where intelligence gathering ended and manipulation began. Those criticisms cannot simply be dismissed. Walsingham used deception deliberately. He allowed compromised communications to continue. His agents entered communities under false identities. Thomas Phelps added a forged postscript to Mary Stuart's correspondence in order to identify further conspirators. By modern standards, many of these techniques raise serious questions about surveillance, privacy, and entrapment. At the same time, the threats confronting Elizabeth's government were not imaginary. The Ridolfi plot involved real plans against the Queen. Babington and his associates genuinely discussed assassination. Catholic exile networks sought support abroad, and Philip II eventually sent a major invasion fleet. Walsingham worked in an environment where religion, dynastic claims, rebellion, and foreign intervention were closely connected. This is why reducing him either to a hero or to a ruthless manipulator misses much of the point. Walsingham was both a committed Protestant and a highly practical state official. His religious convictions shaped the way he identified danger, but his methods went far beyond religious policing. He treated information itself as a strategic resource. His most important innovation was not simply hiring more spies. He tried to create a continuous intelligence process. Information had to be collected, copied, compared, stored, decoded, and tested against other reports. Single rumor might be worthless, but the same detail appearing independently in Paris, Antwerp, and Madrid could become significant. He also understood the importance of networks. Arresting one conspirator was useful only if that arrest did not destroy the opportunity to identify financiers, couriers, safe houses, foreign supporters, and other participants. This was the logic behind allowing the Babington Channel to continue long after the government had already penetrated it. The same way of thinking shaped his response to Spain. He did not treat the Armada only as a fleet of enemy ships. He treated it as a system dependent on finance, food, barrels, artillery, transport, communication, and coordination with troops in the Low Countries. Every part of that system could generate intelligence, and every weakness could be exploited. In this sense, Walsingham helped change the relationship between information and government. A state did not have to wait for an enemy to act before responding. It could study preparations, intentions, finances, and communications in advance. The purpose of intelligence was not simply to explain what had happened. Its real value was allowing government to intervene before events became irreversible. That principle is what gives Walsingham's career its wider historical importance. Later British governments would create much more formal systems of intelligence, cryptanalysis, postal interception, foreign espionage, and counterintelligence. These institutions were far larger and more professional than anything available in the 16th century, but the basic logic was already present in his work. Collect information from many sources. Compare it rather than trusting one report. Protect your own communications while penetrating those of your opponents. Follow money, logistics, and relationships, not only armies. Watch networks long enough to understand their structure. Most importantly, act while intelligence can still change the outcome. By the time he died in April 1590, Walsingham had spent most of his adult life trying to prevent England from being surprised. He had watched exiles, priests, diplomats, merchants, nobles, foreign courts, and military preparations. He had read messages that were never intended for him and built channels into organizations that considered him an enemy. He had survived Maria's persecution, years of exile, the violence of Paris, repeated conspiracies against Elizabeth, the execution of Mary Stuart, and the approach of the Spanish Armada. Yet his final struggle was neither a conspiracy nor an invasion. It was the combination of illness, family obligation, government debt, and the financial cost of the system he had spent years maintaining. Walsingham's life therefore ended with an unusual contradiction. The England he had helped protect remained intact, while the man who had built so much of its intelligence machinery died heavily burdened by debt. His family buried him quickly and quietly, and his financial accounts were not fully resolved for another 2 decades. His grave eventually disappeared as well. But the method he helped establish did not disappear with it. The lasting significance of Francis Walsingham was not that he created espionage from nothing. Spies had existed for centuries. His achievement was turning scattered spying, intercepted correspondence, code-breaking, diplomacy, finance, and political analysis into parts of a single system. That system was designed around one simple principle: a government that learns about danger early has more choices than a government that discovers it too late. Walsingham spent his career making sure Elizabethan England saw its enemies before they reached the throne, the court, or the coastline. The state he protected survived the crisis years of her reign. He did not survive them with his health, fortune, or public standing intact. That is the final contradiction of his life. Francis Walsingham helped build the machinery that kept Elizabeth's government alive, but the same machinery consumed much of the man who built it.